The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The nation of Sri Lanka suffered an economic collapse leading to protests and riots, and the president and prime minister fleeing the country this summer. What was the source of this political turmoil? Well, would you believe fertilizer? In 2021, the former prime minister ordered farmers to stop using chemical fertilizer and use organic fertilizer instead. The ensuing events touch on an issue that's concerned economists for almost the entire time of our profession, namely famine. And the consequences of crop failures in Sri Lanka illustrate some important points about international trade and finance. Joining me on EconVersations today to help make sense of of what happened in Sri Lanka is Peter Earle. He's an economist with the American Institute for Economic Research. Mr. Earle studied engineering at the U.S. Military Academy and earned graduate degrees in economics and finance. And he's worked in the finance field for 20 years before joining AIER. Peter has edited 6 books for AIER and published numerous op-eds in other pieces. And he recently appeared on Fox News to discuss events in Sri Lanka. Welcome back to the show, Pete.
Thanks for having me.
Well, so let's just talk a little bit about, for our viewers to set the scene here and, let them know what happened in Sri Lanka, the events that ended up coming to a head this summer with, in effect, the government being forced out of power.
Yeah, so, what a lot of people didn't know was really happening really came to land in our consciousness, came to our attention in mid-July with images of crowds and riot control police trying to keep hordes of individuals, Sri Lankans, away from the Capitol building. And essentially the president was forced, or the prime minister rather, was forced out of office. And there was civil unrest for some period of time. And it all had to do with the decision to just overnight in 2021 end the use of synthetic fertilizer in lieu of organic fertilizer.
And there were some pretty significant reductions in crops in Sri Lanka in the aftermath of it. And it started almost immediately after the banning of chemical fertilizers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Something like 1/3 of the lands of the land that used to be arable became idle. 20% drop in rice within 6 months of the edict. Declines in everything else, including tea, which is an extraordinarily important crop in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, and we'll come back around to come full circle on this, and we'll see why tea was a key in this economic crisis. Now, some viewers might be thinking, well, talk about crops and farming here. This seems like something more for the farm report as opposed to a show about economics. But it turns out economists have long been talking about issues regarding famine and food production. It goes all the way back to one of the first economists, Reverend Thomas Malthus, right?
Yeah. Thomas Malthus really is credited for the expression the dismal science. In that he made predictions that eventually population would outrun the ability to produce food. And overpopulation and starvation and all of those themes started with Thomas Malthus, but they're still with us very much today.
And in fact, the entire term Malthusian refers to this whole sort of like outlook, worldview of things are always going to be pretty dismal. Humanity's always going to be on the verge of starvation and a plague. Right. And there's certainly some modern Malthusians, people like Paul Ehrlich, who've consistently rehashed this theme, right?
Oh yeah, I mean it's really a perennial. I'm not sure if that has to do with either a recognition of exactly how fragile our supply chains in our agricultural sector are, which has really kept aloft and kept working by markets and prices, or if it's just that bad news is exciting and it sells, probably a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that helped hold, I guess, famine at bay in the modern world, and to largely eliminate famine in many parts of the world, was something called the Green Revolution that occurred in the years after World War II. And it was sort of like, at one level, is what Sri Lanka was going against with this chemical fertilizer ban. Tell us a little bit about the Green Revolution and this great scientist, Norman Borlaug.
Yeah, so the basic idea, as I understand it, is that essentially by developing new strains of wheat and other sorts of crops, they became more disease resistant, and they had higher yield on whatever the unit is per acre or per hectare or whatever. And for that reason, you could argue that Borlaug, who most people don't really know his name, but this is a guy who arguably has saved over 1 billion people from starvation. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary story that, like so many in economics, is really underappreciated, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think about that for a moment, and think about like somebody who actually saved probably at least 1 billion lives. It's pretty amazing for that. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and yep. he also laid out the idea that he thought that higher yields from crops would help protect the environment. In fact, help halt deforestation, because he thought, if our best croplands, or if the best croplands in places like Indonesia or India or Sri Lanka could actually yield more food, then we would, then people there wouldn't need to cut down the forests to have more land to grow low-yielding crops on it. And I think his foresight there has been widely verified. That yeah, higher food, better productivity in agriculture. Not only does that release people to do other things in the economy and society, but it's also good for the environment in terms of reducing our impact on nature, especially on forests.
Absolutely. So if we can grow better, more hardy crops on less farmland, and it's enough that we need, we can allow forests to grow again. We can do other things with that land if we want to. And I think really the impact of that is really similar to that of money, as we can is money allows us to specialize, and having food security on a wide basis allows us to do everything from train surgeons to become ventriloquists. It's a wide variety of things we can do.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think about it, one way to measure the standard of living in a society would be to look and say what percentage of the population is engaged in agriculture. Because when people do nothing, when people can't do anything more than simply feed themselves and keep themselves alive, then, as you say, they can't become brain surgeons, they can't become engineers, they can't become composers, and or write Shakespeare's plays or anything else. They're going to spend all their time and energy and efforts just trying to get enough food to stay alive.
I'm going to wave my arm quick so my light comes back on. There we go. But yeah, no, it's a fact that if you look at certain places in Africa, for example, there are still people who spend most of a given day securing water or securing food. And once that's alleviated, it allows for a fantastic diversity of talents which improve everyone's lives to emerge.
Yeah, and these talents and the importance of humans is a theme that the great economist Julian Simon, who you can say is the ultimate or anti-Malthusian, a theme that he emphasized repeatedly in his work, that that the mind is our ultimate resource, and it's really been all of these advancements in technology that have allowed us to raise above subsistence.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that the Malthusians, now I think the Malthusians originally got the shapes of some of the curves wrong. I think they thought they were geometric when they were arithmetic or whatever. I know I learned that in grad school, but I think the most important thing is that they simply didn't take into account the fact that people will always have new ideas, and people will always be coming up with new means of dealing with scarcity and new systems using prices for allocating resources. And that, again, I mean, dire predictions may be exciting, but in fact, We have wonderful and full lives because we're constantly innovating, and that innovation comes from the most unexpected places at times and unexpected people at times.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an important part of it, because if we knew what we were going to learn, we'd already know it. And in fact, discovery has to always be a surprise in some extent.
Yep, exactly.
So the Green Revolution was all this advances in agricultural science. I guess all the ag schools and the agronomists and plant biologists paying dividends for human society. And now we go back to 2021, Sri Lanka sort of went in the opposite direction, sort of trying to, it was fertilizer as opposed to plant seeds, but it was still a clear movement away from sort of modern technology-based agriculture and back to a simpler form of farming, if you want to think of organic farming in that fashion. What was some of the thinking going on here?
Well, I mean, we've had this sort of recent arrival. I guess it's taken many forms, but the most recent form of sort of environmental and commercial political thought has been ESG. Now, that started with stakeholder theory and a number of other theories, but ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance measures to evaluate a firm, that's in addition to, say, profit or whatever, and in some cases comes before profit, holds companies and holds, in this case, there were ESG scores for nations being considered, and it holds them to certain strictures, including exactly how, or the level of carbon that's being generated, and what the social what social features are available for, say, women and minorities to get a better shake in society and that sort of thing. And ESG has more recently been sort of a guideline for certain large-scale agricultural and commercial practices. And I mean, it sounds like a bad joke, but just about the time when Sri Lanka had these problems and went off of synthetic fertilizer in favor of organic fertilizer, they had a near perfect ESG score.
Right. Yeah.
Which says a lot.
Yeah, 98 out of 100. But they adopted this policy that was going to impoverish, in some case, push a lot of Sri Lankans into poverty, and extreme poverty, not like poverty you have in the United States, but extreme poverty.
Right. I mean, so two quick thoughts on that is that it takes an astounding amount of foolhardiness to do something like that by decree overnight. I mean, I wouldn't agree with it, because we've progressed to this point by means of specific and purposeful steps. But I could see if perhaps some well-meaning political figures said, okay, we're going to try to edge back 5% per year or 10% per year, but to overnight tell farmers who, in many cases, had never used organic fertilizer that this is the new standard is absolutely it's political, it's social malpractice on a tremendous scale, and yeah, I guess that was my major point. I get, the other thing is that I once had an intern, and she was from a part of the world where she said, a lot of Americans don't understand. Where I come from, starvation means you die. It doesn't mean you go without lunch. It doesn't mean, poverty or impoverishment doesn't mean you have one TV instead of two. It means death. And so a lot of Americans, for good reason, I mean, we sort of earned this position, but we could stand to be a little more sober about the realities out there, and that starvation literally means, no food until, one expires or something like that in many other countries.
Yeah, yeah, and so let's get into some of the consequences of what happened here, because Sri Lanka had, before this decree, they were more than self-sufficient in food. They had, and it was rather a remarkable transition to get to the point where they were actually able to export rice. They were able to feed their population, and then actually have some rice left over to sell on world markets. Now, If the rice crop had declines just on its own, that would have been bad, but there could have been things that Sri Lanka could have done in response to that. And you mentioned tea. So explain to us why tea is a part of the story as well, even though they weren't going to eat tea.
Well, my understanding is that tea is a major export, and that without tea, they weren't able to generate the type of foreign exchange that they typically need in order to engage in other sorts of trade. So typically, countries like Sri Lanka, smaller countries, typically they don't trade in, say, the Sri Lankan rupee. Internally they do, but for international trade, they would use the dollar, the euro, the pound, a much larger, even say the Aussie dollar or the Japanese yen. But what happens is, and that's just one factor. There are a number of reasons why they got low on foreign exchange, but tea is the big one that brings in a lot of foreign exchange. And without that, they found themselves in a much bigger, in the midst of a much deeper economic morass.
And the fertilizer mandate affected the tea production as well. So, I mean, it'd been one thing if you needed to go out and buy some rice and you had the foreign exchange that you were earning, you're still selling tea on the market, and then you could use the proceeds for that to buy rice instead of like televisions or something else that you maybe would have liked to have. But now you don't even have like the foreign exchange, the access to the purchasing power in foreign markets to go out and buy the rice that you're going to need to import.
Which also means that when it came time to reverse, to do it about face policy-wise and bring in organic fertilizer again, there wasn't enough currency to do so.
Okay, yeah, that's another good point there. And then also a nation like Sri Lanka, another thing that was contributing to their foreign exchange woes was that they certainly owe a lot of money. They've borrowed money over the years, and again, they would have to use foreign exchange to pay those debts, right?
Absolutely. So usually when a country takes debt, usually their debt service is due in the currency which they borrowed in, whether that's dollars, whether that's Chinese renminbi, or whatever. And in the last, say, half decade, Sri Lanka has engaged China for a number of very large building projects. They've incurred a lot of debt for other things. And for that reason, the combination of not having a cash crop, not having exports, rather, to receive Forex, the pandemic, the Easter bombings, which really cut tourism, which usually brings in foreign exchange, they found themselves in an extremely detrimental position throughout the second half of 2021, and in particular, the first 5 or 6 months of 2022.
Now, you mentioned some of the COVID, for instance, and some persons of, I guess, environmentalists who don't want to blame the fertilizer mandate for this have argued that, well, no, it wasn't the fertilizer, it was COVID and other issues that brought down Sri Lanka. What's your response to that?
So, I mean, the Easter bombings led to a drop in tourism. COVID led to a sharp end to remittances, as well from Sri Lankans living abroad, as well as low economic output within Sri Lanka. And for all those reasons, all those dollars, euros, sterling, it all disappeared. And then we had like drops in commodities prices, and all of this stuff really became sort of a toxic environment in which the last thing you would want to do in terms of being a responsible government official is do an experiment, especially one upon which your food security depends.
You mentioned a term in there that I think we want to elaborate on or expand on a little bit here for our viewers, and it is remittances, because it's actually like a really important concept in international finance. So explain for us what is meant by remittances, and how in many ways, I think this is like by far the most beneficial form of foreign aid, if you want to think of it that way. Probably a lot more valuable than government foreign aid.
So, I mean, a really familiar version of this for Americans involves Mexican citizens. Mexican people come to the United States, they work in the U.S., and they send dollars back home. Dollars are a more valuable currency, not only for their use, but also for their, comparable to say Mexican pesos, inflation resistance. And so a large stream of dollars is always heading back to Mexico. And many Sri Lankans work in India, they work in Europe. Some of them go to grad school and they wind up in the United States or Japan or places like that. And they're constantly sending home either dollars or euros. And that's a very important source. It's a major source, in fact, not the major, but one of the major sources in addition to foreign exchange, in addition to exports, for Sri Lanka to get a hold of foreign currencies.
And then they also obviously benefit the family members that they send the money home to, and you know,
of course,
and that
right.
that in many ways, you know, if you've got a relative who's in the United States working and they send some money home and you're able to use that to help start a business, you know, then you're not only benefiting the economy here in the United States, but those remittances are helping to build up the other country's economy.
I mean, something like as little as $50, you know, once a month or twice a month, you know, if $20 of that becomes savings and the rest becomes money to purchase things or to start a small business, I mean, there's an inestimable benefit to doing so. Plus, there's a sort of a specialization in that, you know, we get talent from other countries and they're able to benefit their countries when they can send some of their earnings back. So I think it's really a win-win in many senses.
So then, as we get into the earlier part of this year, the economic situation really, you know, I guess the building effects of these foreign exchange, limited foreign exchange, and difficulty of trying to import the food that they need to import, or as you mentioned, even go back to importing chemical fertilizers, all
right.
started to build. So, like, what were some of the facts on the ground, or what were some of the statistics, the economic statistics they were facing there in Sri Lanka earlier this year?
So I mean, they had a tremendous drop in their equivalent of GDP in just economic output, economic growth, but also they had to, the government wound up printing money. They wound up inflating the Sri Lankan rupee, and so in a short amount of time we had inflation of, I believe it was over 80% in the month of June, although I have to check that. I know that we had rice. They had rice prices up 50%, tomatoes up several 100%. Something like 50% or 80% inflation overall. So I mean, on top of everything else, you now have this tremendous rise in the general price level, which affects everyone. And you know, it's inconceivable, but in the space of, what is it, 14 months, you have a country that was self-sufficient and had some debt problems, you know, had some things to deal with, nothing much worse than any other country, become almost a completely despondent and dependent state.
And because Sri Lanka had actually, I think, moved up out of the, I guess, the lowest, the way the World Bank rates countries. It had moved up from the lowest income countries to the bottom of the middle tier, middle income countries, because their economy had been growing. They'd had a civil war some number of years ago, but putting that behind them, their economy had made great strides.
Yeah, no, it had. So, I mean, it's really, I can see why ESG proponents will really want to distance themselves from this story. But the fact is, every condition up to that point where the overnight decree was made to switch from synthetic to organic fertilizer were manageable. They were bad, but they were manageable. The real tipping point, and the point which really acted as the agent of so many other knock-on effects, which really drove the country, sadly, to its knees, was this decision to force the use of organic fertilizers overnight. And I have to stress overnight.
Yeah, and you know, and that's also sort of like, you know, Indonesia's a similar income country, I think a little poorer than Sri Lanka, but you know, they had many of the same kind of stresses as Sri Lanka, except they didn't have the fertilizer decree, and you know, Indonesia hasn't fallen apart like Sri Lanka, or India suffered. You know,
I'm sure we can find many examples of countries like that. I mean, when we look back, the idea of China building all these highways and that sort of thing, there's something that happens with a lot of third world countries where they want to build railroads. They really seem to equate, you know, infrastructure and stuff with wealth, when actually there's not always a causal effect. Not having major highways doesn't necessarily mean that's why, or doesn't necessarily pave the way to becoming a first world country. But even so, none of those things put the economy of Sri Lanka and its people in such mortal danger as the fertilizer decree did. That was the tipping point, and that was the one that really set everything that we've seen since then in motion.
And so essentially then, by this summer, I guess we were getting into what you could call food riots, in that people didn't have food. And, and again, here in the United States, it's as you mentioned, it's just so hard for us to even understand. But I mean, if you're a parent and you've got your children and you can't feed them, that's got to be just like the most absolutely gut-wrenching, heart-rending, experience in the world, because as a parent, like, that's like your first responsibility is to like feed your children, and when you don't have any food, I mean, you make a similar point about the baby shortage, baby formula shortage here in the United States. I mean, it brought some of that whole fear, and that was probably the worst thing in the world you could feel back home to us. But that you can sort of understand why it set off food riots.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a dad. I get it. Awful. Can't even imagine.
And so I guess they had regime change of a sort in Sri Lanka.
An abrupt sort, yeah.
Yeah. So where do you think things are going in Sri Lanka forward from here? They've rescinded the ban on or chemical fertilizer, but they still have difficulty trying to import it.
Yeah, so these types of events are usually asymmetric in their formulation, a very rapid drop and then a tough hole to climb out of. So I haven't followed it extraordinarily closely, but I know that restructuring the debt is something that they are trying to do. And also, I believe that they are encouraging that the government has encouraged use of either the euro or I don't think the Indian rupee, but oftentimes what happens, not only in hyperinflations, but when you have these high inflations, is citizens are encouraged to use other currencies. Now, of course, with a lack of foreign exchange, that's difficult to do. But my understanding is that they're slowly winding their way out of that. But there will be a lot of pain along the way. It will probably be very difficult for Sri Lanka to borrow money in the future, which is probably a blessing in disguise. But there are certain things they might want to borrow for. And I think that if we were to salvage some silver lining here, it is that no matter what they say, the proponents of ESG will probably behind closed doors be much more cautious in what they endorse. And certainly, even if they aren't, leaders of nations are going to be, one would hope, much more careful in attempting to impose these these new rules on business sectors, especially agriculture.
And it probably should, at least for Western people, Western leaders, especially environmental leaders or proponents of ESG. I mean, I hope it would lead them to seriously rethink some of their priorities here, because, like I said, when you have people starving and people thrown into extreme poverty, that is not. There's no way, there's no score you should be having that shows that that's a good thing to have happening.
No, definitely not. I think I'd be very proud of America's 45 or 50 score, and maybe we should even shoot for lower.
Well, any final thoughts here before we wrap up?
No, just the organic fertilizer decision was made based upon ideology and not based upon. It was not guided by prices and markets, which would be a much better guide for these sorts of things. But the unintended consequences of these types of policies have been stunning. Let's hope they don't have to be relearned over and over again. That's my hope.
Well, that's a good hope. And of course, if they repeat these errors too many times, I guess they won't be completely unintended or unforeseen consequences. Well, thanks for coming on and talk about this with us, and thank you all for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.